The timeline, added in version 7, provides a whole new way of working with displays and control functions in blocks. It's based on a familiar horizontal timeline containing specialized tracks. Use a block track to work with display content. Then drag images and video to this track. Move the cues along the track to control their timing. You can now present this block on a spot just like other blocks. Here I'm using a separate browser window to demonstrate how that works, but in a real installation this would typically be a NUC or other small form factor computer running our free Pixellab Player software. Click the play symbol or press the spacebar in the timeline window to run the timeline. You can instantly jump to any point along the timeline with all content following along. You're not limited to images and video. You can use pretty much any type of block available on the block menu, such as a website. Cues are rendered back to back. So to shorten the cue, you move the next cue to an earlier position along the timeline. Use the select to end command first if you want to move all the following cues. A default transition can be specified for the entire track. This can be overridden for individual blocks, just like in a slideshow. If you need to play content across multiple displays, just add more block tracks. Apply a tag to each block track with the same tag assigned to the corresponding display. This controls which content appears where, taking full advantage of Block's multi-display capabilities for synchronized playback across many displays. Again, I'm using a separate browser window just to demonstrate this, but here you would of course have a separate player and display. The timeline itself can be synchronized to other time sources if desired. Here I'm using an external timecode feed to drive the timeline. The timecode here comes from a timecode generator app on my Mac, but could of course come from any external timecode feed or other time source connected to blocks, such as an external media server. Let's move on to another track type. Use markers on a marker track to indicate or label interesting positions. Name a marker to make it easier to find or to refer to it programmatically later. Drop markers while playing the timeline using the keyboard shortcut M. By default, cues snap to markers, making them useful for lining things up along the timeline. For example, to audio that was playing while dropping the markers. Next up is the property track. Here each track controls a single property. As you may know, properties are a fundamental concept in blocks and are used to control pretty much anything. Here I have added 2 tracks to control a moving head fixture. I've also built a simple control panel here in blocks. You can use this panel to manually control the fixture. The 2 property tracks here are bound to the same properties as the joystick. So when I jump into the cues, their values are applied. You can configure a property track to show the value in a more user-friendly form, such as a percentage. Add new cues to a property track through the menu or using the keyboard shortcut P. New cues automatically take on the current value of the property, here set using the joystick on the control panel. For some property types, you can also apply a fade rate. I'll set the move here to 2 seconds. Add a new property track using the timeline menu, then bind it to the property to be controlled, such as the white value of the same lighting fixture. Yet another way of controlling property values is using this tab. If you then also turn on Auto Record mode, any changes you make will automatically add or update property queues. You're of course not limited to control lighting. You can control any kind of property in this way. Here I have added property tracks for some Modbus relay outputs talking to this NetIO box with 4 mains power sockets. I just plugged in 4 little lamps here so you can see what's happening. Normally you would of course use a NetIO box to turn power on or off for some other device. The last track type is the do track. Queues on this track are very similar to do statements in tasks. A do queue can set the value of any property in blocks. That's useful for one-offs when you don't want to dedicate an entire property track. For example, I can activate one of those power relays that you saw earlier like this without using a property track. You can see the status changing of the relay here. A do queue takes effect only when you run across it on the timeline. This is different from property queues, which are applied also when you jump on the timeline. Here I'll use a do queue to switch content on the display using this simulated display down here again. A do queue can also call functions that take multiple parameters in one go. For example, to navigate to a nested block using the goToBlock function. First, let's find the block path. Then paste this path into the do queue. Now, running the queue navigates to that content on the display. Finally, since timelines also have properties and functions, you can use a do queue to control them in the same way. Use the top-level item named self to control the current timeline. The goToMarker function tells the timeline to go to a named marker. Also set the play parameter to true to keep the timeline running. This creates a loop on the timeline, repeating the same section. At this point, you may notice that the block tracks no longer have any effect, since the timeline block isn't assigned to any of our 2 test displays anymore, but the timeline can still run, performing its other control functions. So as you have seen, the timeline is a multifaceted block type, letting you play and synchronize content across displays and control lighting and other functions using property and do queues. It does this in a very intuitive way that's easy to understand and to use.